In 2009, Bionic Commando released into a crowded, hostile landscape. The industry was drowning in gritty reboots, military shooters, and brown-gray realism. Everything wanted to be serious, everything wanted to be important. And into that space walked a game about a man swinging through the ruins of a city with a robotic arm bolted onto his body. At the time, Bionic Commando was received with confusion. Critics didn't hate it, but they didn't love it either. Players bounced off its difficulty, its strange movement, and its infamous story twist. It wasn't a hit. It wasn't a disaster. It just sort of disappeared. But here's the thing, Bionic Commando is not a bad game. It's an uncomfortable game, a stubborn game, a game that refuses to meet you halfway, and because of that, it's worth talking about, not as a failure, but as a warning, a lesson, and maybe even a quiet tragedy of its era. To understand Bionic Commando, you need to understand its lineage. The original Bionic Commando from 1988 was famous for one radical ideal. You could not jump. Instead, you used the grappling arm to swing across gaps, climb walls, and fight enemies. It was weird, it was difficult, and it was beloved because it committed fully to that identity. Fast forward 20 years, Capcom wants to revive old franchises. Retro is cool again. Grin, a Swedish studio, is tasked with modernizing Bionic Commando for a post-Gears. This decision defines everything for better and worse. The core ideal is movement as identity. Let's be clear, Bionic Commando lives or dies on its movement system. You grapple onto buildings, poles, cranes, enemies, anything highlighted by the environment, and you swing. Momentum matters, angles matter, timing matters. You are constantly managing speed, height, and direction. At first, it feels wrong. Your muscle memory betrays you. You fall into radiation zones. You slam into walls. You miss grapples by inches. The game does not ease you in gently, and it does not apologize. But then something clicks. When it works, when you chain swings, launch yourself forward, grab a ledge at the last second, and vault into combat, it feels incredible. There's a physicality to movement here that most third-person shooters simply do not have. You aren't floating. You aren't gliding. You are fighting gravity. And that's the game's greatest success. Why so many players bounced off is because the problem isn't the ideal. The problem is trust. Bionic Commando demands that you trust its systems before it's earned that trust. Early levels are restrictive. The city is segmented by invisible radiation walls. Swinging too far, too fast often leads to instant death. Checkpoints are unforgiving. Failure feels punitive, not instructive. The game asks you to master momentum without giving you safe space to experiment. In other words, it teaches like an old game, but presents itself like a modern one. And in 2009, that was dangerous. Players expected smooth onboarding, tutorials, soft failure status. Bionic Commando offers none of that. It throws you in a hostile playground and says, learn or leave. Combat in Bionic Commando is conflicted. On paper, it's ambitious. You have guns, grenades, melee attacks, and a bionic arm itself. You can pull enemies towards you, throw objects, and even weaponize momentum. But in practice, combat often feels secondary to traversal. Gunplay is serviceable, but unremarkable. Enemies are spongy, cover mechanics feel awkward when the game clearly wants you moving, not hiding. Boss fights swing wildly between exhilarating and tedious. The arm is most interesting not as a weapon, but as a movement tool. When combat forces you into static shootouts, the game loses its identity. It's at its best when movement is the fight. And that goes with level design. A city that feels afraid of you. Ascension City should have been a playground. Instead, it feels nervous. Large spaces are hemmed in by radiation barriers. Verticality exists, but exploration is discouraged. The environment constantly says, don't go there yet. This clashes with the fantasy of the bionic arm. You feel powerful, mobile, almost superhuman, but the world keeps pulling the leash. Why? Because the designers are afraid you'll break their game, and that fear is felt everywhere. Rather than embracing chaos, the levels funnel you. Rather than encouraging experimentation, they punish curiosity. It's not that the environment are poorly made, they're just overly controlled. The game never fully trusts its own mechanics. Now we have to talk about the story. Nathan Rad Spencer returns from death row to stop a terrorist group called the Ascension. The tone is grim, militaristic, self-serious. This is not inherently bad, but it clashes violently with the absurdity of the premise. The dialogue leans into edgy masculinity. Spencer is angry, bitter, constantly scowling. The voice acting, most notable, Mike Patton, commits hard, but the writing doesn't support the weight it wants to carry. What's frustrating is that beneath the clumsy execution, Bionic Commando is trying to say something. It's about weaponized bodies, loss turned into utility, movement as freedom in a controlled world. The bionic arm could have been a metaphor for trauma, for survival, for adaptation. Instead, the game spells everything out, and in doing so, strips away nuance. Subtlety dies, symbolism collapses. The ideals are there, they just aren't trusted. Visually, the game holds up better than expected. The ruined cityscapes are detailed, animations convey weight, the arm feels heavy and industrial. The soundtrack does its job, tense, atmospheric, occasionally bombastic, but rarely memorable. Where the game stumbles is tonal consistency. It wants realism, but the mechanics are inherently gamey. It wants emotional depth, but its characters are archetypes. Nothing quite syncs. Critically, Bionic Commando landed in the dreaded middle ground, mixed. Not bad enough to mock, not good enough to celebrate. And that's the worst place to be. It wasn't what casual players wanted, it wasn't polished enough for mainstream appeal, it wasn't confident enough to become cult classic immediately. So it faded. In retrospect, Bionic Commando feels like a game from the wrong timeline. Today, players celebrate difficult movement systems, they praise games that demand mastery, they embrace friction. But in 2009, the audience was smaller. This game asked too much, too early, and explained itself too poorly. And it dared to be different, and that matters. Bionic Commando is not a masterpiece, but it is honest. It commits to a core ideal and refuses to abandon it. It fails loudly, it succeeds quietly, and it leaves behind a feeling few games manage to evoke. Regret. Not regret for playing it, but regret for what it could have been. In an industry obsessed with safety, Bionic Commando took a risk, and sometimes that's enough to remember it by. It isn't a game I'd recommend to everyone. It's rough, it's stubborn, it doesn't explain itself well, and it asks more from the player than most games of its era were willing to ask. The story stumbles, the pacing drags, and there are moments where frustration feels intentional rather than earned. But if you're the kind of player who values movement over gunplay, who enjoys mastering systems that initially feel hostile, who doesn't mind friction as long as there's a clear mechanical identity underneath it, there's something here worth experiencing. This is a game for people who like oddities, for players who enjoy games that don't quite fit, for those who are willing to meet a game on its own terms. Bionic Commando won't impress you immediately, it won't hold your hand, and it won't always reward your patience. So no, it's not a forgotten masterpiece, but if this game's energy, mechanics, and tone align with your taste, if you're curious about a time when big budget games were still willing to take uncomfortable risks, then yeah, give Bionic Commando a try.